Welcome to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Neurosalience podcast. I'm Peter Bannattini, and here we discuss brain imaging with scientists from around the world. A couple of weeks ago, the announcement came out that the editors of NeuroImage would be resigning. So just to summarize, NeuroImage, published by Elsevier, started in the early 90s and has steadily grown into the lead journal in neuroimaging and the go-to journal for high-quality papers that span from methods and modeling to applications. It has an impact factor of about 7 and publishes about 1,000 papers per year. Importantly, it has a truly special culture among its editors. They not only are leaders in the field, but work together in a way that fosters the best, most innovative papers that have been continuously advancing the field for the past 3 decades. Attempts were made to negotiate with Elsevier. However, they wouldn't budge on their open access publishing charge, or APC, which is currently at $3,450. The price is likely more influenced by how much people are willing to pay in a market where the APC appears to exponentially scale with impact factor, independent of actual publishing costs. On this podcast, I have 2 of the senior editors of NeuroImage, Sonja Kotz from Mastricht University and Shella Keilholz from Emory and Georgia Tech. They have been with NeuroImage for many years, and here they give us a bit more insight into the factors leading up to this resignation and what will be happening moving forward as the editors migrate to a nonprofit company, MIT Press, to start the new journal Imaging Neuroscience with an APC of $1,600. In this discussion, we also touch on the current publishing landscape and how that's changing as new platforms and nonprofit companies emerge to help keep costs low, to the benefit of authors and readers alike, and ultimately for the benefit of the science. We also discuss the extremely unique and special culture of the editors of NeuroImage, now Imaging Neuroscience, and how this has been so fundamental to the quality of the journal over the years, and how it will surely continue with the new journal. Lastly, we talk a bit about the future of publishing, from what will be published beyond just PDFs to the challenge of reviewing and curating as more and more papers are produced. So I hope you enjoy this. Okay, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourselves and maybe mention how long you've been with NeuroImage and anything else you'd want to say.
All right. So, my name is Sonja Kotz. I have been with NeuroImage until recently, and I was actually shocked looking at my numbers. I started out 19 years ago, first for quite some time as a handling editor and then as a senior editor. My work is in between cognitive neuroscience, and I go across all dimensions. That was also initially the reason why I really wanted to do this job, and it has really grown on me. Partly because it is excellent outlet, it has the right diversity, it has, and that is most important to me, even at this stage now, an incredible team dynamic going on, which is not a given at any journal. And that has really also carried us through these discussions and this decision making to step out of NeuroImage and continue with imaging neuroscience.
Shella.
So Shella Keilholz, I was a handling editor at NeuroImage for 9 years and only recently joined the team as a senior editor, actually as of January 1, just in time to resign. Although I spent the last year as a kind of senior editor in training and was in on all of the discussions and the negotiations that went up to this. So I really want to second Sonja's views of the community nature of NeuroImage. I feel like it's really a journal that's driven by our research community It's where people who work on all aspects of brain function can come together. So it's one of the few places that people who work in preclinical research, like about half of my lab does, meet with the people who work in clinical research or in research on basic human brain function. And I think that type of crossover is really valuable for fertilizing research and really pushing the field forward. I, like a lot of us, I really love NeuroImage. I am excited to devote my time to it. But I think we were at the point where something had to change because the publishers had all the leverage in terms of setting fees.
All right, thanks. So just to give an example of how hard all the editors work too, I know when I was a handling editor, I would get about, or a senior editor, I'd get about 10 papers a week and have to hand them off to either to handling editors or handle them myself. As editor-in-chief, I would get at least 10 papers a day and just have to, basically, I wouldn't have to handle them myself, but just sort of just decide on how to manage them. Is that still the case, or is that, so how many papers are you getting, let's say, a week?
Yeah, it goes, I would say it goes through waves, but I kind of did a bit of a calculation because I got curious, and I think I end up handling about 180 in total a year. So you can imagine it goes up and down, but it could be easily 10. It could be less than 10 a week. So it's a continuous flow, at least for my domain.
I haven't really had a chance to get a really good feel for what it's like as senior editor, but I had to look back at the numbers because I never kept track of how many papers I handled as handling editor, but it looked like I did about 100 a year.
And also, I think it's worth noting that there's no salary. There's sort of an honorarium that's a couple of $1,000s a year or something like that. But it's essentially very, very cheap labor. But it's obviously the benefit is to your. I mean, I've usually found that I loved being editors just because I loved the stream of information coming in, and I felt that I was pretty good at it, and I felt it was an important job. So we're doing it. We're motivated by the stimulation and to be part of this community. And I think, as you both mentioned, the NeuroImage team, I mean, it's grown tremendously over the years. It's been growing steadily, but I think it's sort of even growing a little bit faster now. I just was amazed when I looked at the number of handling editors has really exploded. And I like to think that over the years, it's sort of been filtered in some sense. There's no term limits to handling editors. And so basically, it works out that the people who are really good and really engaged and really like it and really work well with the team stay on, and the others come on and they try it and they don't like it maybe or whatever, and they rotate off. And so it's sort of like this filter that's been happening where the team is over 20 or so years has been created to be really optimal for handling this large number of papers, large diverse papers, really communicating well internally. And there's something to say for the culture of a journal that is independent, I think, of the platform. Certainly the platform was helpful. It was a very good platform that we worked on, but I'm sure that the platform that they're going to, they'll talk about, will be a great experience for everyone. But the important thing really has been, and will continue to be, the culture of the editors, which really, I think, adds to the quality of the journal more than I think people fully appreciate. So when did this discussion first come up? I know that the announcement came 2 weeks ago. Has this been something that's been a continuous discussion for a while?
Yeah, I was trying to think about that, and I think even during the time when Mike Breakspear was still the editor in chief and had kind of gotten this whole thing rolling with Elsevier, we had discussions about the prices. I think that discussion has been ongoing because it is a critical question. What is ultimately really a necessary price to cover costs and pay staff, and where does the benefit start, and why does it exponentially go up with impact factors and things like that. So I think this discussion has been ongoing, and I think it's a critical one. And so I think when Steve came on, we just continued and we said, okay, so now it's cropping up slowly, but it keeps cropping up. And sometimes it wasn't even clear that they were changing prices. So, it's a very subtle dynamic. And then you say, okay, so at the end of the year, it may go up another 200, and we're just going to be willing to do that. And I think that was sort of the tilting point. But realistically, we started serious discussions at the beginning of the year. So Shella came on and was right away thrown into this discussion. I wonder what that did to you, but I'm super glad you came on board.
Well, I can't say any of it was a surprise because I mean, we've been talking about this even among the handling editors for a long time now. This was not limited, to the senior editors in terms of discussion. And I know a lot of the authors and reviewers who submit to NeuroImage would come up to me as a handling editor and say, why are the fees so high? I'm not going to deal with Elsevier anymore. I'm not going to review. I'm not going to submit. So I think we were getting this input from the community at large. It wasn't just, something that the editorial board felt like on our own account. It was really part of this larger discussion where pressure was coming from all ways. And, I guess the only semi-critical comment I've seen on Twitter was, what made the editorial board feel like they could mess up this journal for everybody else? And my response to that is that, this was driven by the community. So I really think that, not only was it the whole editorial board, but we're doing our best to represent the concerns and the issues that have been raised by the community in terms of how to publish in a top quality neuroimaging journal.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting criticism. I can see in some sense, right, from for some researcher who is perfectly fine with some, the fees, or they don't submit for open access or whatever. They're like, oh, what's going on here? This is does mess things up a little bit. But I do think you're right that overall the community was starting to look at this and like thinking, oh, this is getting more and more expensive. And in general, all the journals are getting more expensive. And looking at it from the perspective of Elsevier, I mean, it's a business, and they have a product. Even though the product is sort of created off of free labor of the authors and editors and whatever, and they have something that is of value. They're gauging, the impact factor is sort of the measure of the value in some sense, and they're saying, well, we'll charge top dollar for this impact factor. And then if people, I mean, the other option would have been people stop submitting, and then they would lower the fees because there's somewhere a balance between papers submitted and fees and how much money they make. But I do think that there's bigger forces at play here, and that go outside of that business model. That people realize that okay, so it's mostly online anyway. Online platforms are not that expensive. It's no longer doing a service of necessarily handing out the printed copies to libraries, and that model of charging libraries a lot for that is starting to diminish. So what is the value? And that's the question I think that we need to be asking more. The platform takes some money, but certainly not the equivalent of this amount. And it's really the editors that make this, that the community that makes this. And certainly right. I mean, you have a journal manager, and Elsevier has this big production behind the scenes sort of thing of copy editing, and that does take money. But once again, I think it's everyone's intuition that this is not that as expensive as they charge. And so, okay, so let's go to the nonprofit. How is that decision made?
No, that's another one of these things. There was always open discussion about these venues and possibilities, and I mean, there were simply propositions because of talking to other colleagues in the field. So there were people who had just recently started a journal at MIT Press, and others had experiences with MIT Press. But there were certainly other options out there. But the way it unfolded, at least from my view, is that MIT Press was quick, efficient, and open to our concerns. And as Shella said, these are the concerns of the community, not just of the editorial board. And that really made a difference. And yes, also talking to other colleagues who simply started there. So I think that was an easy transition this way.
Yeah, and I know that right, there's some discussion or some consideration at least of whether OHBM should be maybe affiliated with uh, Imaging Neuroscience or not. But I think that the right decision was made in that regard. And also, MIT Press has already a tried and true journal that's started up and is doing quite well. Network Neuroscience with Olaf Sporns. Um, if that look and feel of that platform will be comparable, that is great. That would be perfect. So the negotiation with MIT Press was that the APCs will be $1,600
Yeah,
for
and
an
that
AP.
seems to be confirmed now.
Okay.
So I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. That really makes a difference, I think, for a lot of people. And then the thought as well is the policy for underrepresented countries, or how would that work in terms of adjusting the APC for those? Has that been thrashed out yet, or?
Yeah, that's pretty much also getting to the stage of being dealt with. And at the moment, it is clear that the aim is to really waive for low and middle income countries. But we want to again develop a fair system to make that possible and not to come across as arbitrary. So there's a bit of work to be done, but that's definitely the aim.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the driving decisions really behind using MIT Press, is that it would allow us the most seamless transition. So our goal is really to keep NeuroImage going, just with a different name. It will become Imaging Neuroscience, but with the same editors, the same reviewers, the same quality level, the same community, everything that really makes a journal a journal.
And that's so key. I think that, yeah, definitely. While the editors, the community is so important, and having a good platform that's tried and true is key, as far as it's a key component of all this. And does look like MIT Press will allow you to hit the ground running. And certainly, right, it takes a couple of years to get the impact factor back and things like that. Well, you'll probably it will be interesting to see how this works. I imagine in 2 years you'll start out at a pretty high impact factor already, just because of the community buying into the editorial team, really. And so, how did you actually decide on the name?
I mean, I think, again, a very democratic procedure. Everyone was asked to come up with names, also talked with colleagues, and we ended up making a list and voting. It's very simple.
That's great. That's great. Well, I mean, it's a perfectly. I mean, it pretty much covers it. Some people, I remember, some people are talking to me like, "Oh, is it neuroscience? Now, is that going to change the journal in some sense? Is it more neuroscience now instead of?" And I'm like, "No, no, no, no. It's just a name, and the journal's the journal, and the culture is the editors, and that's yeah. It's not like they're going to change their agenda in any sort of way." Um, One other thing that has there been any discussion as to the possibility of publishing other objects like Jupyter notebooks or data or videos or?
I think it certainly is on the agenda, and I think right now it's our goal is to make the transition as efficient and fast as possible, because we know people want to bring their papers into this new journal. There's a lot of motivation to transfer work, and so we're busy trying to get this settled as soon as possible. So, but that there's got to be a level of growth here as well, and there need to be further discussions, at least for my taste, what is doable, also given the many different regulations in different countries, what can go up, what cannot go up. This type of stuff will take a bit of time, but in principle, following with that concept, that would be a great move. But we will need to take it one step at a time here.
Yeah, we've also talked about making some changes to the review process at some point in the future, maybe writing consensus reviews, based on discussion amongst the reviewers. But again, something to consider down the road. We want to make the transition first and do our job of keeping the journal going. Then we can kind of go on from there. I've got to say, though, I'm very excited about Aperture and the possibility of submitting research objects. We just had our first one accepted. So I'm glad to know that there are parallel experiments going on that will let us examine both of these pathways at once, right? Because I think we need all of these developments if we're really going to open up scientific publishing.
I completely agree. And I do think it's really wise to just start with the traditional platform of PDFs. And you mentioned a good point too, the reviewing model. A lot of people, I think, are comfortable with it, and it works. It's sort of, some people might say it's a little bit outdated, just having your paper depend on 2 or 3 reviewers and then just put it in. But I think that what I've always found is that if you have really good editors, which you do at NeuroImage, they're able to take in the reviews and decide pretty well as to what to do. And I think that if you have good editors, that model really does work well. And sometimes I've seen other models where sometimes the review process gets bogged down because you have to, like for instance, the consensus model is good in theory, but sometimes it can get bogged down if people just don't agree or whatever. And then you have the leverage is taken away from the editor and more towards the reviewers potentially. There's all kinds of issues that crop up that are unexpected sometimes if you mess with the model too much. I mean, and some people would even say, oh well, let's just have an open model where papers are submitted and they're just published and then they're upvoted or downvoted. You could have something totally open like that. And of course, you always risk then having it, if it's too much community driven, then who knows how that would work. I mean, would you still have, with NeuroImage, that it's been vetted by these expert reviewers, and there's something to say for that.
I think one of the benefit of a system that we have is it's not just a top-down decision. I mean, I personally talk to all of my handling editors. I ask for opinions. We agree whether we need an external board member to come on board. So these decisions are not just arbitrary, they're informed. And of course, there's always a level of subjectivity in this, and the authors may feel that, but I mean, as long as you keep a dialogue going, I think it's fair, and it allows you to keep the high level of quality and focus that a journal like that can deliver. And I think that's an important point before we expand into all sorts of other issues. But I mean, I think it would be good if there was more dialogue potentially, or an increased dialogue between those of us who are actually now moving towards new venues, new platforms, to kind of also say, okay, what works with this new approach, what doesn't, where do the old models still bring us the right level of objectivity.
And I do think, yeah, no, I think that you're right. I mean, I think that the key is to have this dialogue, and yeah, once again, just to going back to emphasizing the internal communication among the editors is a lot of journals, that culture doesn't exist as much. People are siloed editors and editorial teams, and having this constant dialogue, you really have a good decision making process. And another interesting thing is that I sort of speculate how NeuroImage will do. They have 4 editors filling in. Do you have any thoughts on that? It'll be interesting to see what the community decides. So
I think that's going to be the measuring stick, the community. But we certainly are motivated to make Imaging Neuroscience the journal in the field with the focus that we used to have at NeuroImage. And there's no doubt about that.
all right. So I'm trying to think of any other concerns or by authors. I think that they're worried. I'm not really worried, but they're wondering, okay, so when do you think Imaging Neuroscience will be open for business?
Well, they're dates that we want to work. But I mean, we're definitely working very hard to have the interim website site ready for papers that being transferred, or authors that decide to pull out and come over. So that this is happening very, very quickly because we want to support this. And then, of course, there may be this interim website may also allow us to have papers submitted to the new journal. But I mean, those papers will then only be published once we're really fully online. But the aim is still mid-July.
Okay.
So pretty much, hopefully, around the corner.
Okay. All right. Just before OHBM kind of gets started.
That would be a great place to celebrate this.
Yeah. And the other thing I think about from an editor standpoint is I love the fact that that NeuroImage sort of had this massive database of reviewers that you could just go on the website and just pick them, and it would automatically send. And you had all the information. You had metrics, even if you really wanted to keep track of that, of how many papers they accepted, or their length of review, or their which really helped choose the reviewers. Will that start from scratch, or were you able to?
I mean, there's been an outpouring from the community to come on board as reviewers. I mean, people that were not interested before or have been doing the job before are saying, "I'm back on board. I'll just do that." And also here, we went into action very quickly. We set up a platform for people to sign up, and I don't think, Shella, it was within a week or so, or even less. It was
very fast.
850 people signing up to review. I mean, so I'm not too worried about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I was
We're
one
over
of them.
1,000 already.
Oh, so I've missed the last number. So yeah, that's just fantastic. Yeah.
Wow. All right. So that's great. That is awesome. Yeah, it's also something to say for the community. I think that our community is special in this regard too. Is that we're, it's, I would say maybe if you count it by the number of people going to OHBM, it's like at least 3,000, but it's probably 5,000 people at least, and they're all they all look at they've all been looking at NeuroImage as the journal. I mean, there's certainly other journals like human brain mapping and brain structure and function, and other ones, met several other ones, but NeuroImage has been kind of the leader in this regard. Hopefully, and I don't know if you've been talking to the other journals, I wonder if they also might reconsider this model and try to negotiate with their publishers, and hopefully this will start a cascade, or at least catalyze something that's, I think, is inevitable. And I know it's impossible to speculate on this. So it looks like NeuroImage and NeuroImage reports, they all resigned, but NeuroImage Clinical didn't. So I'm not sure exactly what to say, other than I'm guessing that they probably were asked to, and they decided not to at this time. Maybe their dynamics were different.
I think that's the best way to put it. I think there's certainly been discussion. We know that, but why exactly they're staying at the moment is I mean, it's also a matter of choice, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and yeah, maybe the clinical audience, they I don't know. Who knows what all the dynamics are? Maybe they felt their community, their users, authors, didn't feel as the need yet to do this sort of thing. So we'll see. That's one of these things. This is a community driven thing, and our community sort of has been speaking loudly about this sort of thing. All right.
And I think we're actually going to see, the effects of this more downstream, really. I'm not too surprised that not, all of these other imaging journals haven't said, oh, yes, we're going to resign too right now. But give us a year, watch us make a success out of Imaging Neuroscience, and I think the dominoes are going to start to fall.
Yes.
Yeah. It certainly has caused quite some discussion and movement, and not just within the community. I think also funders are watching this. decision makers in countries are watching this, because they strike deals with these big publishers to make things accessible, but they may say, should we continue that? So there are quite a few questions that have arisen.
And I think people are starting to realize how much money is involved, right? If you say, oh, I'm going from 3,500 down to 1,600 for one paper, well, maybe that's not a huge deal. But, most labs publish a lot. Maybe we publish 10 papers a year. Now you're talking about support for a graduate student. That's money that could be put to something much more productive and substantial than lining the publisher's pockets.
And also, I think, I don't know how it is. I know in the States still people can publish non-open access, but I think there's a little bit more pressure to publish open access in Europe. Is that
That's true. I mean, almost all funders now request that you do that. But yeah, that's when the discussions start. And I agree with Shella. You're looking at the amount of money that you can get for particular calls, and there's a lot in Europe, for example. You pay a lot for staff. PhDs are staff, for example. So I get into mega discussions why we're so expensive. But it adds up very quickly. And then where do you start cutting, right? So then you say, oh, well, maybe we're not going to this many journals that have these high costs because we cannot afford it.
Yeah.
So that's always the first thing that goes. And I think this will make things a lot easier to be a bit more flexible in terms of supporting your team and young people to go to conferences and things like that. I agree.
It is interesting to think, the NIH ultimately is funding this, or in the United States. There's major government funding sources in Europe and elsewhere, but and the thought is, it's interesting. I sort of I talked to at least some of our leadership with the NIH, at least intramural, and they're shocked with, and they said, oh, if we submit a paper to NeuroImage and or not NeuroImage, let's say Nature Neuroscience, and want open access, that's like sending 10 people to a conference. It's huge. It's huge, and it makes you think, well, do I really need to publish in Nature Neuroscience? I mean,
and I really want to understand why this is necessary, and it is kind of driven by, well, it's a super high impact factor, and for that you have to pay. No, that shouldn't be the case.
Right. That's kind of the currency of the
Yes.
publishers.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because at some point I think that government funders might say, wait a second here, this is not money well spent. And who knows, they might put a cap on how much you're spending. And so and publishers, that's sort of like a big hammer on this sort of thing. And it's not, we'd rather be community driven, but at the same time, that's something that could eventually come up, and that could change things drastically pretty quickly. So it's going to be interesting that I'm sure there'll be analysis of how much it actually costs to publish a paper, and maybe some guidelines into what's considered reasonable. And I think, yeah, this move definitely has catalyzed that thought process, at least in our community, a lot more. And maybe it might extend out beyond this as well, since it did make quite a splash in other communities as well. They all took notice. So what do you think? So just to speculate a little bit more wildly, I mean, things seem like they're changing so rapidly now. How do you think this will end up? I mean, none of us have really thought about this deeply.
I'm willing to just throw stuff out there. It's okay. Yeah. I don't mind being wrong. But I think that there's always going to be some kind of curation. The problem I think about with, just putting preprints out online is that there's too much stuff. I can't go and look every day and figure out what's going on. It's just enormous. I don't know if we want to trust that to AI. Maybe there will be a role for that at some point, but that's a scary conversation in and of itself. But I think, what NeuroImage has really provided, and what Imaging Neuroscience will provide, is this curation of high quality, interesting, impactful articles, so people know where to go, and so that you don't have to read 10,000 abstracts to kind of figure out what's new and exciting in the field.
I sign off on that.
Yeah, and that is the challenge, right? It's certainly it's because we're being overwhelmed with data. We're being overwhelmed with information. It's nice that if you get a paper from NeuroImage or now Imaging Neuroscience, you know that it's been it's been vetted and reviewed, and the review process isn't perfect, but it's good. And typically, when I look at a bioRxiv paper, for instance, I usually my own filter before I even read the paper is like, oh, this topic is interesting. Okay, it seems kind of catchy, but then I think, well, do I recognize any of the names on the paper? Do I kind of know them? And that's a pretty good filter if you've been in the field for years, but it may not be the best filter at all. And it really does bias against, the young people who are less well known, who are publishing great stuff. And so you kind of hit it on the head, Shella. I think that the challenge is to have a really efficient way of curating the papers and getting it out there in the most accessible way.
I thought you brought up a great point about people possibly a curation method being biased against early career researchers and people who are breaking into a field, for example. Because I think that's one of the groups that we worried a lot about in this transition. Because, if you're going up for tenure, you need that impact factor. And so one of the things that the editorial board has talked a lot about is trying to come up with something to mitigate that and to maybe write a letter describing the wholesale migration of NeuroImage to Imaging Neuroscience that could be included to explain the lack of impact factor for the next couple of years. So, this is not just a problem for the future. I think that's also a problem for the present that we need to address and make sure that we stay on top of. Because our early career researchers, of course, are the future of the field. These are the people we want to really see succeed.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think a lot of people, and there's a lot of countries that I know that, like, for instance, in China, they heavily weigh impact factor of the paper that you're submitting to or the publishing through. And so this might cause maybe a dip in hard to make it a little bit harder to get going with imaging neuroscience. But I agree. And just to revisit really quickly, the impact factor is just based on the last 2 years of papers with their citations. So it should get back to where it, I wouldn't be surprised if it would be at least 7 once it comes out for imaging neuroscience.
I'd like to raise, though, that in some countries, at least in Europe, this hype about impact factors is very critically discussed, because people say, is that at a cost of quality that people are pushing so hard? And so there's a lot more a strategy to maybe select your best publications that you think are your best publications and argue for it. And so that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in high impact factor journal, but it is important for reasons A to B to Z. And I like that idea a lot, because I think it's been overhyped, even though we all rely on it, but it's been overhyped. So maybe also something to think about.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that out. That's also a really important point. Impact factor is, it's a factor. It's what they can calculate. It's sort of useful, but I do think it's also way overhyped in this regard. And the challenge is to come up with what are better metrics. People are always searching for an objective metric in some sense. I do agree, though. Okay. All right. Well, I think that covers pretty much everything. As much as we can speculate about now, I know for myself, I'm really excited and for what's going to happen, because I do think it's going to turn out really well, not only for imaging neuroscience, but for the imaging community and publishing in general. I think it's a good step in the right direction. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and I wish all of you the best of luck.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Neurosalience is brought to you by Organization for Human Brain Mapping. This week's episode is produced by Ömer Faruk Gülban and Jeff Manser.